I'm going to call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology for our hearing on challenges and opportunities of the 5 gigahertz spectrum band. With unanimous consent, Mr. Waxman has to be down at the White House. Without objection, I'd like to start and allow him to give his opening statement as a courtesy to the former chairman, unless anybody wants to object, or I didn't think so. So we will start. I know it's out of protocol and all, but we actually try and get along here from time to time. So I'd yield to Mr. Waxman and allow him to give his statement since he has to depart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and Ms. Eshoo for your courtesy in allowing me to go forward, and I thank my other colleagues that are here for not objecting. I appreciate we're holding this hearing on the promises and challenges of freeing up additional spectrum in the 5 gigahertz band for next-generation Wi-Fi services. The Public Safety and Spectrum Act of 2012 contained a small but important provision requiring NTIA and the FCC to study and open up additional spectrum for unlicensed services in the 5 gigahertz band. Many members of this committee, including Ranking Member Eshoo and Congresswoman Matsui, worked hard to ensure this provision was included in the final legislation. And because of these efforts, superfast unlicensed services known as gigabit Wi-Fi are closer than ever to becoming a reality. We know that unlicensed spectrum has been an incredible economic success story. The development of Wi-Fi could not have happened without it. But as existing unlicensed bands become increasingly congested, we must open up additional frequencies for Wi-Fi services to meet skyrocketing consumer demand. And the potential for delivering unprecedented data speed over gigabit Wi-Fi networks promises to transform the 5 gigahertz band into a test bed for breakthroughs in innovation. Unlicensed spectrum is essential to our nation's wireless broadband ecosystem, and unlocking the potential of the 5 gigahertz band is critical to maintaining our global leadership in mobile broadband. Making more Wi-Fi spectrum available does not come without challenges. As a threshold matter, we must ensure incumbent systems in the band, whether they are operated by federal or commercial users, are fully protected from harmful interference. In particular, the life-saving potential of state-of-the-art driver warning systems must not be undermined. We're at an early stage in opening up the 5 gigahertz band, and I believe any process going forward must be fair, transparent, and driven by engineering. As I stated last year, the administration should continue to pursue an all-of-the-above approach to make more spectrum available for commercial mobile broadband services. This approach includes opening up underutilized spectrum for sharing. In an increasingly crowded spectrum world, spectrum sharing shall be the new normal, not the exception. All stakeholders should work together to develop sound technical solutions to make this possible. I'd like to welcome our impressive panel of experts. Mr. Knapp, welcome back to our committee. We've always appreciated your efforts to explain highly technical issues in language policymakers can understand most of the time, and I know you will help us again today. I look forward to hearing from all of our panel of experts. Finally, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege to acknowledge Roger Sherman, as today's hearing will be the last he will participate in as a member of our committee staff. Members of the committee know Roger not only for his deep expertise on telecommunications matters before this subcommittee, but also his wise guidance as Democratic Chief Counsel. Roger's dedication, knowledge, and pragmatism truly exemplify the best in public service. Fortunately, Roger will still work closely with us in his new role as the Wireless Bureau Chief of the Federal Communications Commission. In that capacity, he'll play an instrumental role in ensuring the success of the upcoming spectrum auctions, including the broadcast incentive auction. This is perhaps the FCC's most critical responsibility in the coming years, and FCC Chairman Wheeler couldn't have picked a better person for the job. I know others may want to comment on his leaving us as well. I hope everyone will join me in congratulating Roger on this new opportunity, and we wish him all the success. They know him.
I don't know.
I have 39 seconds. I'm going to yield to Ms. Escher.
Or I'll use my time when you
Okay,
acknowledge
good.
me. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. I want to join the gentleman in honoring Roger and thanking him for his many years of service here on the committee and for the people of America and your continued service. Let the record show I already have a draft letter to you in your new role. And, you know, that's a couple of minor things I'm sure you can fix. But we're delighted that you're going to stay part of the public process, and we welcome you in your new role. We regret you leaving here, but we wish you Godspeed and great fortune.
And we want your responses by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Mr. Waxman, that'd be 8. Yeah, it's Republican time. All right, we'll get back in regular order here, and I'll give my opening remarks. The subcommittee meets today to continue our oversight of the FCC's progress in implementing the spectrum provisions Congress passed last year as part of that Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. While much has been made of the incentive auctions, and those first-of-their-kind auctions are incredibly important, we also took concrete steps to improve access to spectrum for unlicensed technologies like Wi-Fi in the 5 gigahertz band. Today we'll hear from witnesses that can give us an update on their progress in implementing those sections and what challenges exist to increased unlicensed use. Unlicensed wireless technologies have become an indispensable part of our information infrastructure in the United States. As a complement to both our residential and business wired Internet connections, as well as a component of our mobile wireless devices, Wi-Fi, perhaps the most prolific use of unlicensed spectrum, has spread from its humble origins in the technical community to near ubiquity. It now helps farmers in rural America allocate water and fertilizer to meet the exact specific needs of crops, thus increasing productivity and reducing costs. It has allowed businesses of all kinds to more efficiently manage inventories, distribution, and manufacturing processes, thus increasing productivity. It allows consumers to communicate on the go and to watch the video services they want, where and when they want to. Unlicensed spectrum technologies have allowed all of us to use devices that have made our lives safer and more convenient, connected, informative, and entertaining. It has and will continue to help create billions of dollars of economic growth and hundreds of thousands of jobs across all of America. Spectrum provisions that were signed into law last year had their beginnings in this subcommittee. We instructed the NTIA and the FCC to begin the process of bringing additional spectrum into the unlicensed marketplace by first asking them to assess the feasibility of doing so without causing harmful interference to licensed operators already occupying the band. Just as we had a central focus on ensuring that broadcasting remained a viable service after the incentive auction, so too did we have a focus on ensuring that new unlicensed uses were in addition to and not interfering with existing licensed services. The 5 gigahertz ecosystem is teeming with existing uses. From critical government radar systems to commercial satellites, there are a host of licensed services that are already deployed in this band. Today, we'll also hear from one of the promising but unrealized licensed uses of this band, intelligent transportation systems for smarter, safer vehicles. However, it is important to also note that 5 gigahertz is also currently being used for Wi-Fi and other unlicensed uses. Thanks to technical rules that limit power and require certain mitigation technologies, these systems are currently meeting our licensed and unlicensed needs without interfering with one another. So we're looking forward to hearing from our very qualified panel of witnesses this afternoon on both the potential that this spectrum holds to fuel the next generation of unlicensed wireless technologies and benefits they will bring, but also the technical and economic challenges to making the most of this band. I think I speak for many of my colleagues when I say that we're excited to see the fruits of this subcommittee's labor come to fruition in the form of faster and more abundant Wi-Fi, but not at the expense of existing licensed services. These services can coexist, and thanks to the hard work of the industries and agencies represented by our witnesses today, we don't have to choose between better Internet access and safer cars. So I thank you for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. With that, I would recognize the gentleman, the Vice Chair of the subcommittee from Ohio, Mr. Latta.
I thank the Chairman for yielding, and I appreciate our panel of witnesses for being with us today, and I look forward to hearing from your testimony today. Let me begin by thanking my colleague, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for working with me during our consideration of the jump-starting opportunity with the Broadband Spectrum Act, which is ultimately included in the larger Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, to include the language directing the FCC, NTIA, and other agencies to study spectrum sharing possibilities in the 5 gigahertz band. In the past, we've discussed the federal government's use of spectrum and the opportunities that exist for improving their use of this valuable asset, as well as our continued oversight of the upcoming incentive auction. Today's hearing offers us yet another opportunity to examine a portion of our nation's overall spectrum policy. The 5 gigahertz band presents a unique opportunity to spur innovation and improve the performance of our licensed spectrum network by offloading much of the mobile data traffic to Wi-Fi hotspots. While I understand and respect the concerns that will be raised here today, I'm confident that industry experts can find a way to optimize this valuable real estate and avoid harmful interference. The fact remains that we are in the midst of a spectrum crunch, and to remain the world's leading innovator and ensure consumer demand is met, we must find ways to utilize spectrum more efficiently, making decisions on technical merits rather than the politics of the past. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, ranking member, for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our wonderful panel, amongst them my constituents. So welcome, and I'm sorry someone turned down the thermostat, but just think, you're going to get back to California before I do, so thank you for being here. Given the tremendous growth in Wi-Fi usage and the need to maintain our nation's lead in developing gigabit Wi-Fi technology, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on the 5 gigahertz spectrum band. The United States has been a world leader in unlicensed spectrum, and I think that this is something that we can't ever underappreciate, its importance, and the importance that we not just rest on our laurels, but that we continue to build on that. I have what I would term is a love affair with unlicensed, and I'm very proud that in the spectrum bill to have really used those two terms, those two words, unlicensed spectrum, just over and over and over and over again to make sure that we honored what that represents for our country and the innovation platform that it is. Now, dating back to the FCC's decision nearly 30 years ago to open up spectrum for unlicensed use, we've been on a very important glide path since then. And since that time, billions of devices have been sold, and technologies such as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. I can't live without Bluetooth. I don't know about the rest of you. I mean, you get in the car and, you know, you'd be hauled off to jail in California if you're seen holding any kind of device in your hand. So it's a reminder to me of how practical the uses are, how many they are, and that they're really integrated into our lives, their household names. They're enjoyed by millions of consumers around the country. Now, by one estimate, in-home Wi-Fi alone may be generating between $4.3 and $12.6 billion a year in U.S. economic value. That's pretty serious money, even around here. That's a lot, and I want to see it grow. When adding the larger unlicensed ecosystem, the figure rises to anywhere between $50 and $100 billion annually. But as Wi-Fi demand has increased, so has congestion, and more than one member has already spoken of this, particularly in the high-trafficked areas such as airports, convention centers, and university campuses. With congestion increasing and consumers demanding faster data speeds, the FCC announced a proposal earlier this year to unleash up to 195 megahertz of spectrum in the 5 gigahertz band for unlicensed use. In July, to ensure the agency's timely implementation of the proposal, I wrote to Acting Chairwoman Clyburn along with Representatives Latta, Matsui, and Issa. In our letter, we emphasized the importance of spectrum sharing and urged the FCC to proceed expeditiously with collaborative testing that includes both incumbents and the Wi-Fi industry. I look forward to hearing an update on these issues during today's hearing, and I know that you're fully prepared for that, right? And good answers for us. Happy answers. While the 5 gigahertz band is an important component of a 21st century unlicensed spectrum policy, it is complementary and not a substitute for low-band spectrum below 1 gigahertz. In fact, one such company who is innovating in this space is Adaptrum, a Silicon Valley startup. And last week they shared the story with a bipartisan group of congressional staffers and explained how the superior propagation factors found in the television band will unlock new unlicensed innovations such as rural broadband access, which so many members of this committee on both sides of the aisle have such a keen interest and responsibility for, and expanded urban applications that wouldn't be possible in higher bands of spectrum. So I think the time to act is now. The FCC should move expeditiously to harmonize existing rules and make more spectrum available for gigabit Wi-Fi. Again, I want to thank each one of our witnesses for being here today and testifying. And at some point, maybe at the end of the hearing, I'd like to get some great words of praise and commendation to Roger Sherman, but I've certainly gone past my time, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Generally yields
and
back.
Thank you for allowing Mr. Waxman and all members for that unanimous consent request. It was a gentlemanly thing to do.
Happy to do it. So anyone on the Republican side seek the last 5 minutes, or should we move on to the witnesses? All right. So we will expedite our hearing and go to the experts. And we're delighted to have each of you here. Thank you for your submitted testimony, your willingness to give the abbreviated versions this morning or this afternoon and take our questions. We'll lead off with the Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology of the Federal Communications Commission, Mr. Julius Knapp. Julius, it's good to have you back before the committee. I concur with Mr. Waxman. It's always helpful as you translate technical engineering issues into understandable policy. So the microphone is yours, sir, and go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to provide you with a status report of the FCC's efforts to provide more access to unlicensed spectrum in the 5 gigahertz frequency band. As the very title of this hearing notes, this process presents numerous engineering challenges. But increased access to unlicensed spectrum in this band could greatly accelerate growth and expansion of new Wi-Fi technology, offering faster speeds, increasing overall capacity, and reducing congestion at hotspots. Unlicensed spectrum has been a phenomenal success story. Innovations that utilize these airways affect virtually every aspect of our daily lives, including Wi-Fi networks that we use in our homes and at public hotspots, Bluetooth technology for connecting mobile devices with wireless headsets and speakers, and for connecting computer tablets and keyboards, electronic keys for opening car doors, identification badges for secure access to buildings, and many other products that are too numerous to mention. Unlicensed technologies have spurred creation of entire new industries and jobs to the benefit of businesses, consumers, and our overall economy. Congress recognized the importance of providing additional spectrum for both licensed and unlicensed use in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Jobs Creation Act. This law specifically directs the NTIA and the FCC to examine the potential for expanded unlicensed use in the 5 gigahertz spectrum. In February of this year, the Commission adopted a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, that satisfies the requirements of Section 6406A of the Act. The Commission's NPRM was focused on 3 separate portions of the 5 gigahertz band. The first portion involves 100 megahertz of existing unlicensed spectrum at the low end of the band. The Commission proposed to remove the restriction on indoor use and to allow higher power consistent with the other parts of the 5 gigahertz unlicensed spectrum. These actions would make the spectrum much more usable for Wi-Fi and other technologies. The second portion of the NPRM would make 120 megahertz of spectrum available in the middle of the 5 gigahertz band, essentially filling in the gap that exists in the existing 5 gigahertz spectrum. It would create a large contiguous block. This would allow more flexibility to accommodate the greater bandwidths of the latest technologies. This band is used by the Department of Defense and a number of other federal agencies. The third portion would make 75 megahertz of spectrum available to extend the upper end of the 5 gigahertz unlicensed band. This spectrum is allocated for intelligent transportation services, such as the Dedicated Short-Range Communication Systems, or DSRC, for vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure technology. These actions would make up to 195 megahertz of additional spectrum available for unlicensed use in the 5 gigahertz band, a 35% increase over the 555 that's available there now. They would also enable greater use of the latest industry Wi-Fi standard, 802.11ac, that uses wider channel bandwidths of up to 160 megahertz to provide data rates of 1 gigabit per second or more. Because of the existing incumbent users in the 5 gigahertz bands, making more spectrum usable or usable at all for unlicensed use will be challenging. But the importance of the 5 gigahertz band and the benefits of unlicensed spectrum generally are clear, and the Commission has indicated its strong desire to move forward in seeking to resolve these challenges. Finally, I want to emphasize that the Commission has not proposed to take away any incumbent user's right to operate as a licensed service in the 5 gigahertz band. As with all unlicensed services, these devices may not cause harmful interference to licensed services and must accept whatever interference that they receive. It is my hope that all parties will work together in good faith to overcome these technical and policy challenges, and that we will be able to find a way to effectively share the spectrum that I described today. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Knapp, thank you for your presentation, your testimony, and we look forward to speaking with you more about that. We're going to go now, make sure I get the right titles, to Mr. Kenny, who is the Principal Research Manager for Toyota Info Technology Center. Mr. Kenny, we're delighted to have you here today. We look forward to your testimony as well, sir. Go ahead.
Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is John Kenny. I am a principal researcher at the Toyota Info Technology Center in Mountain View, California, where I lead our vehicular networking research team. Despite remarkable advances in the crashworthiness of vehicles, tens of thousands of Americans are still dying in traffic accidents each year. We firmly believe that the next great opportunity to reduce fatalities rests with technologies that will prevent crashes in the first place. Dedicated Short-Range Communication, or DSRC, is such a technology. DSRC enables vehicles to communicate with each other. DSRC vehicles broadcast precise information, such as location, speed, and acceleration, several times per second over a range of a few hundred meters. Other DSRC vehicles receive these messages, use them to determine if any neighboring vehicles pose a collision threat, and then warn drivers of those threats. DSRC vehicles can also receive safety-related information from roadside infrastructure, such as the state of an upcoming traffic light or the presence of ice, a disabled vehicle, or a pedestrian in the road. NHTSA concluded that connected vehicle technology has the potential to address approximately 80% of crashes involving non-impaired drivers. They further determined that DSRC at 5.9 gigahertz is, quote, the only communication option at this time capable of effectively and reliably providing this safety of life capability, end quote. DSRC can and almost certainly will be used for other non-safety applications. Just as the Internet has moved far beyond its original email and file transfer applications, DSRC is also likely to unleash innovative connected car applications that go far beyond collision avoidance. I recognize that there is some skepticism about DSRC and concerns that the benefits are being overstated or that the automakers will never bring the technology to market. I can assure you that Toyota is committed to DSRC as a critical safety technology. We have already commercialized DSRC in other markets and would like to bring it to drivers in the United States in the near future. We are not alone in this. The auto industry has been working hard here in the United States to pave the way for DSRC deployment, leading to the publication of core technical standards in 2009 and 2010. USDOT is also conducting research and field testing with Toyota and other automobile companies to prepare for widespread deployment of crash avoidance systems that use DSRC. At this point, pre-production prototypes have been developed and are currently supporting large-scale evaluations of applications that address the most critical crash scenarios. In August, Toyota and 7 other automakers completed a year-long connected vehicle pilot program with US DOT in Michigan. The model deployment, which included nearly 3,000 DSRC vehicles, demonstrated vehicle-to-vehicle applications in real-world driving scenarios and verified the maturity and stability of the standards. The results from the pilot are expected to inform a regulatory decision by the agency on DSRC technology by the end of this year. As you are well aware, the FCC issued an NPRM earlier this year that solicited comments on opening the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum to unlicensed devices. Toyota is not conceptually opposed to sharing the spectrum and believes that it may be possible for DSRC and unlicensed devices to coexist in the band. However, we also believe that the creation of a sharing framework or the implementation of sharing rules should not be considered unless and until, 1, a viable spectrum sharing technology is identified, and 2, rigorous testing verifies that there is no harmful interference from unlicensed devices. Interference that results in delayed or missed driver warnings will undermine the system's entire foundation, rendering it essentially useless and putting the future of DSRC technology in the United States at risk. Although we are strongly committed to it, the automobile industry cannot responsibly deploy safety-of-life DSRC technology unless the possibility of harmful interference from unlicensed devices is ruled out. Toyota is committed to helping validate a technical sharing solution once one has been identified. We have been actively engaged with the Wi-Fi community and other stakeholders who are exploring possible sharing solutions that alleviate any risk of harmful interference from unlicensed devices. But we're not there yet, and it's going to take more time to see if we can get there. Until then, the FCC should refrain from taking any further action on the 5.9 gigahertz band. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Kenny, thank you for testifying. We'll now turn to Mr. Nagel. Tom Nagel is the Senior Vice President, Business Development at Comcast. Mr. Nagel, thank you for being with us, and please go ahead.
Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am pleased to discuss the many benefits of Wi-Fi and how the 5 gigahertz band is critical to ensuring Wi-Fi continues to serve as a platform for innovation, investment, and economic growth, all without harming incumbent users. At Comcast, one of my primary responsibilities has been the strategic development of our wireless efforts, and in particular, our Wi-Fi efforts. Comcast operates a Wi-Fi network that has expanded exponentially in less than 2 years, from 5,000 access points last year to nearly 350,000 access points today. We have also partnered with other cable operators to give our customers access to more than 100,000 hotspots, with many more to come. My experience in building and operating a Comcast network shows me firsthand the important role that Wi-Fi plays in the broadband marketplace. Consumers use Wi-Fi for cost-effective and robust wireless access to the Internet. And various studies confirm that unlicensed services like Wi-Fi contribute tens of billions of dollars in economic value each year. Wi-Fi networks have also proven to be valuable during emergencies. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy last year and the attack of the Boston Marathon this year, licensed wireless networks were temporarily overloaded or down completely. In both cases, Comcast opened its Wi-Fi network to provide free access to anybody with a Wi-Fi-enabled device so that people could receive urgent information and communicate with loved ones. All consumers with a Wi-Fi-enabled device can use Wi-Fi, regardless of their wireless carrier. So it is a powerful and flexible tool in emergencies. However, 2 challenges stand in the way of this continued growth. First, the spectrum used in Wi-Fi today is severely congested, especially in densely populated areas. And without quick action, consumers will begin to experience reduced Wi-Fi performance. To address this problem, we must ensure that there is sufficient unlicensed spectrum to meet growing consumer demand. The 5 gigahertz band is critical to this effort. Second, the next generation of Wi-Fi, often called gigabit Wi-Fi, requires larger channels than are currently available and technical rules that facilitate reasonable deployments. Gigabit Wi-Fi can only be done in the 5 gigahertz band. If we fail to make the necessary changes, we risk falling behind other nations that will deploy the next generation Wi-Fi. Fortunately, Congress, the administration, and the FCC have already taken steps towards addressing these challenges. Comcast commends Congress and this committee for passing the Spectrum Act of 2012, which specifically identified the 5 gigahertz band as a powerful and unique resource for Wi-Fi. And we strongly support the FCC's implementation efforts. The FCC has proposed 2 unlicensed bands in the 5 gigahertz and sensible rule changes to existing bands. These improvements are essential to relieving existing Wi-Fi congestion and providing enough spectrum to support gigabit Wi-Fi. Importantly, under the FCC's proposals, Wi-Fi will be able to share the 5 gigahertz band without causing harmful interference to existing users. This approach maximizes the value of spectrum for all Americans. Although portions of the 5 gigahertz band may present complicated technical issues, in some subbands, the FCC has a clear path to move forward now. Specifically, the FCC should adopt its proposed rule changes in the UNE-1 band, which would make 100 megahertz available for Wi-Fi almost immediately. Importantly, the Department of Defense recently announced that it does not need access to UNE-1. That means that just one company uses all 100 megahertz for a small group of customers. And technical studies have shown that proposed rule changes would not cause harmful interference to the incumbent in the band. This should be our top near-term priority. Comcast is also enthusiastic about expanding Wi-Fi operations to the UNE-4 band. We have reached out to the ITS companies to find a sharing solution that protects ITS and allows for Wi-Fi investment. Now is the perfect moment to do so, because there are no commercially deployed ITS vehicles using the 5 gigahertz band. We are willing to be flexible to ensure that ITS is protected. We ask that the ITS interests also agree to be flexible. There is a solution to be had. The days where incumbents can hold exclusive rights to unutilized or underutilized spectrum have long since passed. Wi-Fi services in the 5 gigahertz band will offer enormous economic benefits and social benefits. Comcast is committed to working with Congress, the administration, the FCC, and incumbents to reach solutions that will maximize the value of the 5 gigahertz band to this nation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Nagel, thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it. And now we'll go to Bob Friday, who's the Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Cisco. Mr. Friday, thank you for joining us. We look forward to your testimony, sir.
Chairman Walden,
and if you could just touch that little microphone button there.
So Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear for you today. It's an honor. Mr. Chairman, we're in the midst of a technology revolution to mobilize the Internet, and it's transforming the way Americans and billions of people around the world collaborate, communicate, and connect to the Internet. The education customers I work with are incorporating video, mobile applications into their curriculum with up to 100 students in auditoriums accessing the network simultaneously. Health customers are relying on Wi-Fi to connect patients, devices, and provide nurses instant access to medical records. And manufacturing customers are increasingly using Wi-Fi to enable workers on the factory floor to have real-time video conversations with experts anywhere in the world. What do these things all have in common? They all depend on Wi-Fi for connectivity. In these areas and so many more, Wi-Fi has become a central way for people to access the Internet. But a new challenge has emerged due to Wi-Fi's spectacular success. There is a looming spectrum crunch in front of us, which if not addressed will slow productivity, economic growth, and American technology leadership and mobility. The widespread adoption of Wi-Fi began in the early 2000s when most of us here got our first taste of mobile Internet at our homes, coffee shops, hotels, and airports. Today, Wi-Fi's reach has expanded into the workplace, air travel, and many other locations. And Wi-Fi will become a critical complement, a safety valve, if you will, to our cellular networks in helping offload mobile Internet traffic from our licensed spectrum. By 2017, 66% of all mobile Internet traffic, fully two-thirds, will either start or end on a Wi-Fi network. Without offloading, licensed spectrum networks would simply be overwhelmed. In just over a decade, Wi-Fi has become a dynamic economic driver, leading to over $37 billion of economic value for the U.S. economy every year. And it's the foundation for a whole new mobile app economy that has created more than 500,000 new jobs since 2007. The development of Wi-Fi is one of the great American innovation stories. 30 years ago, unlicensed spectrum was considered junk or garbage spectrum, a place for tinkerers and inventors to build low-power devices of limited use. Then the FCC came up with a simple ideal: change the rules to allow spread spectrum technologies to share unlicensed bands. with the one caveat: no harmful interference to incumbent users. Innovators and entrepreneurs rushed in. Wi-Fi was born, and the results have been breathtaking. 6 billion Wi-Fi enabled devices have been shipped since 2000, and this number is expected to grow to 15 billion by 2017. Wi-Fi has become the industry standard alongside cellular for connecting to the internet now. Wi-Fi will be a driver in the development of the next internet as well. We're moving to an internet of everything that will connect people, process, data, and things. It's leading to profound changes in manufacturing, agricultural, energy, and dozens of other sectors. But this potential is limited by the looming spectrum crunch. So what can be done here? Industry has a major role to play, particularly in the development and deployment of next-generation Wi-Fi, known as 802.11ac. This technology is more efficient and can handle vastly more traffic than previous generations. It will deliver throughputs of 1 gigabit per second or faster, hence the name Gigabit Wi-Fi. Here in front of me, I have the first Cisco Gigabit Wi-Fi access point. In June of 2013, it became the first enterprise access point to have a Gigabit Wi-Fi certification, one of over 190 devices that have been certified to date. So Gigabit Wi-Fi is real, it's here, it's needed to meet the exploding demand for video, but to realize that full potential of Gigabit Wi-Fi, wider bands of contiguous spectrum are needed. So policymakers have a major role to play as well, providing more spectrum. The Energy and Commerce Committee led the way in 2012 when you directed the FCC and NTIA to study the feasibility of sharing additional spectrum for Wi-Fi in the 5 gigahertz band. And I want to thank you for your leadership on this, as well as the effort to establish voluntary incentive auctions. To be sure, there are some significant technical challenges in the 5 gigahertz band. It is not cleared spectrum. It contains incumbent uses important for national security and public safety. And it's imperative that Wi-Fi not create harmful interference to these incumbent systems. And Cisco will not settle for less. Yet, with the leadership from the FCC and NTIA and the cooperation of our industry partners, we are confident that technological solutions to these challenges can and will be found. Bottom line, adding more spectrum for broadband and Wi-Fi will lead to new ecosystems, new industries, new jobs, as well as help ensure economic technological leadership around the globe. Cisco stands ready to work with this committee and other policymakers to find solutions to the important challenges before us, and I want to thank you for your time.
Mr. Friday, thank you, and I think we all agree this is a huge opportunity for the country for innovation and technology, for new jobs, new devices, replacement of all our existing devices so we can communicate faster. I have a question for the group. Qualcomm, which manufactures equipment for both intelligent transportation applications and Wi-Fi, has suggested that moving ITS operations to the top of the ITS band and then excluding them from sharing with Wi-Fi would solve many of the challenges in the Uni-4 band. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the comments of Qualcomm in the FCC's proceedings on this matter, without objection. So, Mr. Friday, let's start with you. Do you agree with Qualcomm's approach?
So if we look at Qualcomm, we think the proposal has merit in terms of spectrum efficiency. We think it may be a little late in the game, given the ITS is as far down the path as they are. So yes, we think it has merit, but we think it may be a little late to the discussion.
Does that mean it's too late for the discussion?
No, I don't think it's too late. I think it's something that's worthy to take a look at. I think we acknowledge that the ITS has done a lot of work on the DSRC, right, and we're sensitive to that.
Okay. Mr. Knapp, is there anything about the top of the ITS band, as opposed to the bottom, that would moot the work that's been done over the last decade on ITS?
So I think ITS has envisioned that it would have the entire 75 megahertz and has been planning for that. So we did not tee up the question of whether we should change the allocation. And generally with unlicensed, it shares on a non-interference basis. So it would be a completely different direction than was teed up in the Commission's notice.
Mr. Kenny, if this arrangement did indeed prevent harmful interference to ITS, would Toyota support such an outcome?
So first of all, we appreciate our friends from Qualcomm stepping up with this idea. We invite everyone to put ideas on the table. We think that there are a couple of fundamental problems with it, which we've documented in our FCC filings. One of them is that it has a premise that all of the safety-critical communication could be compressed into one or two channels, and the fact is that's just not true. With the plans that we have for using the spectrum for collision avoidance, for public safety, for automated driving, for security, for a number of other things, we need all of the spectrum, and we plan to have safety-critical communication in all of it. So that premise that underlies their proposal just doesn't quite bear out. The second motivation that they offered for putting this forward was that it was a way to streamline this whole process, perhaps to maybe something we could all agree to in the space of a couple of months and skip all of this. But that misses the point that we've been, for our V2V collision avoidance work, we've been concentrating and testing rigorously with our current ban plan. And if we were to change and reshuffle the deck, so to speak, we would need to repeat a lot of that testing. We would incur a lot of delay. We have to worry about cross-channel interference issues,
Sure.
for example, that we haven't had to worry about yet.
So let me ask you two questions. I think you began this effort 93 or thereabouts. What's your timeline, do you think? And I realize you're innovating as you go, trying to get this right. And the second point, are there sort of safety, security communications in this 75 megahertz of band? In other words, is it all critical safety, or are there other offerings that could be moved somewhere else?
Yeah, so with regard to the timeline question, as you probably know, we're at a fairly critical point waiting for the NHTSA regulatory direction. There are a number of different deployment paths we can take. Once we get that direction, it'll become much clearer. But we are at a pre-deployment phase. Our technology is mature. The fact that our European colleagues are committed to deploy this in only 2 years from now is evidence of that.
Are they using the same band?
Yeah, they're using a subset of it. They have 30 megahertz that is a subset of our 75.
And are they able to do everything there that you're proposing to do here?
Well, they're planning to augment that with 2 additional allocations as time goes on. So they're starting with 30, then they're going to go to 50, and then they're going to go to 70. So it would be 70 that matches.
Is there 30 mission critical? Is it safety, security first?
Yeah, that's what they're starting with.
And is the other, will it be safety, or is it additional?
I think that it remains to be seen. That what they're saying is that the middle 30, their 30 is in the middle of our 70, if you will, and that's safety critical. They're planning to put some non-safety applications in the next 20.
What would that be? Give me an example.
Examples of that might be infrastructure to vehicle communication to provide navigation assistance or traffic updates, or even commercial services to tell you what you can access in the road up ahead.
All right.
But to come to your second question, then, yes, there are non-safety critical communications that will be in our band, but they won't have a dedicated channel. They'll be mixed in at a lower priority below, if you will, the safety critical communication that we plan to put in these channels.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Kenny. My time's expired. I'll turn to my friend from California, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each one of you. Important and very interesting testimony. I want to start out, Mr. Nagel, by thanking you and Comcast for what you did during the tragedy in Boston by for the use of your network. And it's stories like that always remind me in the hearing room or whatever I'm doing here that we have a wonderful sense of unity about us, even though we've got lots of problems, challenges. Some we create, others are there, and we have to, address them. But it was wonderful to hear you talk about that, and so I salute you. I think the entire committee does. Thank you, Mr. Knapp. I leaned over and I said to my colleagues, Henry said that Mr. Knapp is terrific at breaking down everything so we can understand it, and I'm having a hard time understanding you. So I want to dig into your testimony and see where we're making some progress here. The DoD recently indicated that it doesn't intend to add additional systems to the 5150 and the 5250 megahertz band, also known as Uni 1 band. Do you think that the FCC can proceed to make the band available for higher power outdoor Wi-Fi services on an expedited basis?
So
Because that would be an important step, I think.
yeah, we're certainly considering that. The issue
Seriously, are you considering it seriously?
whether we can address that lower piece first. It was not subject to the additional studies, but just to be clear, there were oppositions that were filed by the satellite industry, and we're busy analyzing that work.
I see. Okay. Well, that's hopeful. To Mr. Friday at Cisco, thank you again. You brought a very important and hopeful message to us in terms of what all of this represents. It's my understanding that Cisco is advocating a listen, detect, avoid approach to successfully manage interference at the 5.9 gigahertz. Does this mean that Wi-Fi and DSRC could coexist peacefully? Put your microphone on. I'm dying to hear your answer.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah.
No, thank you for the question. And yes, Cisco has proposed a solution to co-share the band with DSRC. We've looked at DSRC. The roots of DSRC comes from .11. So compared to radar, it has the same DNA as .11. We think there is a relatively easy way to share the band and be able to detect the DSRC signals and basically vacate the band within a blink of an eye once we detect those signals.
Excellent. So to Mr. Kenny, what Mr. Friday just described sounds exciting to me and reasonable. Do you agree?
Yeah, so to echo my earlier statement, we're very happy that Cisco has stepped up with this idea, and we think that it has real potential. The fact that there is this common DNA, if you will, between the DSRC underlying technology and Wi-Fi is a positive that makes it so that they should be able to detect us and vacate the channel when they detect us.
And to Mr. Friday and Mr. Nagel, can you describe the difference in consumer experience between existing Wi-Fi and gigabit Wi-Fi?
Sure. You know, today what we have is we have a Wi-Fi environment we've all spoken about how we all use it. It's highly digestible. It's in everywhere we are. And I think one of the things we're experiencing today is that we use it a lot. And so one of the components of that experience is that in certain places we get congestion and the things we want to do we can't do as much as we used to. What gigabit Wi-Fi does is that it really begins to expand our ability to drive very, very high rates of information to not just one device, but multiple devices, maybe even hundreds of devices. And so the platform that's getting built for an individual user will feel faster. It'll feel better. It'll feel like I'm more connected. Just like I always had an Ethernet cord right into the back of my device that none of our devices have, it will feel very similar to that. Equally importantly, though, as you think about gigabit Wi-Fi, there's a consumer experience side, but once you build it, then you have this platform that you mentioned, rightly, which is it is an innovation platform. Once you build it, you're going to have lots of companies that come out and begin to go deeper and build great things we don't even know about today.
Wonderful. Do I still have some time?
So to add on what Tom is saying is the customers we're working with right now, like in universities and higher ed, the use cases we're seeing is in these auditorium and classroom cases where they're actually getting to a congestion problem where students cannot get access to the curriculum on time. So that is where WiGig brings the capacity we need to basically solve these high-density type of use cases. The other consumer use case we're seeing right now is in our healthcare industry. The healthcare industry has been probably at the leading edge of adopting Wi-Fi. When you go into these hospitals now, besides the nurses, we've connected probably more devices in the healthcare space, and this is becoming a critical issue now of how to make sure that all these healthcare devices...
Oh, I've seen it at Lucille Packard Children's Hospital in the operating room.
Yeah, no, it's become, the healthcare industry is a good example where they've become highly reliant on Wi-Fi to connect these sensors to all the people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've certainly
welcome.
gone past my time. Thank
Turn
you.
now to the Vice Chair of the full committee, Ms. Blackburn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here. And Mr. Friday, I want to thank you for mentioning the health care. We see so much of this in Nashville, and there is a tremendous amount of cross-usage and innovation. And one of the things we hear regularly from people is, you know, what are we going to do about the spectrum crisis that's coming? And as they do connect more healthcare devices, we are seeing firsthand how important that's going to be. I want to ask you a question. Going into your testimony, you said that a successful outcome to the FCC's current examination of 5 gigahertz means that Wi-Fi cannot create harmful interference to those incumbent systems. So let's touch on that for just a minute and see if you'll tell me what you think needs to happen to find a solution that protects against harmful interference to the incumbents and also accommodates some of these new unlicensed devices and technologies that can continue to help grow the economy but also expand the uses. The healthcare, we have a lot of entertainment product in Nashville that is trying to share the space. We had, I see your heads all nodding, last week was CMA week in Nashville, and of course with all the performances and tours, this is something that we discussed a good bit. So if you'll just speak to that for a couple of minutes, I think I've got constituents that would be interested to hear your answer.
Yeah, so when you look where unlicensed started with, the whole premise was sharing without harmful interference to the incumbents. You know, the journey started back in the 80s with spread spectrum, and that was kind of the initial technology that we brought to share the spectrum. DFS was the next technology we brought to share with the radar bands and uses. The work we're working with the ITS community right now is really another detection technology. In this case, we think it's a relatively simple technology since we have the same DNA. You know, when we look forward and how we can share the other bands, we're looking to new technologies like databases. You know, and we believe that, you know, as we move into this mobile internet world, you know, given spectrum as a fixed resource, you know, we are going to have to start developing more sharing technologies to keep up with the mobile demand that we see happening in that space.
Okay. Mr. Nagel, did you want to comment on that?
You know, I think the Wi-Fi area in general is a great way to take fantastic broadband speeds we're all used to that are sitting at our desk in our home and our office and make it available outside of that, that footprint. It's mobile broadband, and it's probably the best implementation of it to where you can do really, really, really fast speeds. Gigabit Wi-Fi is one of those things that allows us to do that. And it's one of the reasons why we're here is because we won't be able to do those things if we don't solve some of these spectrum issues, especially in the unlicensed band and the 5 gigahertz, both at the lower end but also at the upper end. I think when you think about, if you look at what's happening in the UNE1 band, that especially with the DoD saying they don't need access to it, it's a great place for us to begin to bring real spectrum and be able to bring it to bear quickly. So if we decided to do that, the FCC ruled that way, your devices you have in your hand today, the access points that we're deploying, can utilize that spectrum very, very quickly. So we'd be able to alleviate real spectrum crunches in those locations, in places that are education, healthcare, those types of things. Where people are gathered, Wi-Fi is a fantastic solution, and it's why we need both spectrum to do more of that, but also broader channels so we can do more of it at the same time in the same location. So it's solving both problems, more unlicensed spectrum, and then also aggregating the channels so we can get the gigabit Wi-Fi working at the same time.
Okay. Mr. Knapp, let me ask you this. We talked a little bit, Mr. Nagel mentioned in his testimony, UNE1. And I want to ask you if you think with one company operating in that 100 megahertz, if the FCC has the information to act now on sharing in that space.
So the issue in that space is simpler than the sharing we're talking about in the other bands. We have a full record. I expect there'll be ongoing dialogue on the one issue that's outstanding, and that is the sharing with the satellite service. Bear in mind that the services that are allocated spectrum, and in this case satellite, are protected against interference from unlicensed. So whatever we do here needs to assure that there won't be interference to the satellite services.
Right. I appreciate that. I just think that as we regardless of which space it is, I think it is incumbent upon us to make certain that we're using it wisely. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Balance for time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I
Ding.
thank you for your courtesy. I commend you for the hearing. I have a number of questions which will require simple yes or no answers. From the start, I do recognize economic and technological benefits associated with wireless growth. However, with regard to unlicensed use in the 5850-5925 megahertz band, I believe that we can all agree that protecting vehicle occupant safety is a goal of paramount importance. To that end, I reference the Federal Communications Commission Acting Chairman Clyburn's September 26th letter to me stating, users of Part 15 devices must not cause harmful interference to the licensed services in the 5GHz band. To Mr. Knapp, is it correct that the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, released a report on unlicensed use of the 5350-5470 megahertz and the 5850-5925 megahertz bands in January 2013? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Knapp, I believe it's also correct that NTIA's report identified a number of interference risks in the 5925 megahertz band associated with unlicensed use and concluded that further study and analysis is necessary in order to mitigate such risks. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now, Mr. Knapp, is it true that the Federal Communications Commission's February 20, 2013 notice of proposed rulemaking seeks comments on harmful interference protection requirements to permit gigabit Wi-Fi devices to operate in the 5 gigahertz bands? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Knapp, is it true that Associate Administrator Carl B. Nebbia of the Office of Spectrum Management at NTIA sent you a letter dated June 10, 2013 in response to the Commission's notice of proposed rulemaking in which Nebbia raised concerns about potential harmful interference between unlicensed devices and DSRC systems? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Knapp, is the Commission actively engaged with the wireless industry, automakers, the Department of Transportation, and other incumbent users to resolve any possible harmful interference issues associated with the unlicensed use in the 5850-5925 megahertz band?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
And will the Commission continue to be interested in that matter in the future?
Yes.
And they've got to, simply because you have potential for very destructive interference. Is that right? Now, Mr. Knapp, given that the Commission licensed the Intelligent Transportation System service almost 15 years ago, is it reasonable to say that it would be premature for the Commission to authorize unlicensed use of the 5850-5925 megahertz band before studies are completed that confirm that such use would not cause harmful interference with ITS services and other incumbent users? Yes or no?
Yes, we would need a complete record.
Now, Mr. Knapp, in your experience, is it conceivable that the Commission would approve unlicensed use of the 5850-5925 megahertz band, which is the one used by autos, before definitively establishing no risk of harmful interference with ITS systems or establishing practical strategies to mitigate such risk? Yes or no?
No, we would not act until the engineering work is complete.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Knapp, alternatively, is the Commission considering moving forward with rulemaking openings up only the 5350-5470 megahertz band to unlicensed use? Yes or no?
Only the could you repeat the question?
Go ahead and
Sorry.
say it the way you think is best to be said.
I don't expect we would move on these bands that are being studied. The one that we are considering where we have a complete record is the lower piece, the existing band.
I certainly thank you. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that I have 2 additional minutes. I've got a lot of questions. I think they're useful to the committee.
Without objection, we'd be delighted to have you continue this line of inquiry.
You're most gracious, and I thank my colleagues. Now, Mr. Friday and Mr. Nagel, are Cisco and Comcast in agreement with the for unlicensed use of the 5925 megahertz band to be permitted? The risk of harmful interference with ITS systems must be mitigated. Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen. To, again, Mr. Friday and Mr. Nagel, are Cisco and Comcast in agreement with both Wi-Fi and ITS systems that they can share the upper 5 gigahertz band without causing harmful interference to one another? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now, will you please submit for the record any harmful interference mitigation proposals that your companies have developed? And would our other panel members please also submit that? Now again, Mr. Friday and Mr. Nagel, will Cisco and Comcast actively engage with automakers to identify harmful interference mitigation solutions in the 5925 megahertz band? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now, a word here from Mr. Kenny. Mr. Kenny, does Toyota appreciate the potential economic and technological benefits freeing up more spectrum for unlicensed use? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Kenny, will Toyota actively engage with the tech community to identify harmful interference mitigation solutions in the 5925 megahertz band? Yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Kenny, all the same, does Toyota agree with that the Federal Communications Commission should proceed only on the basis of a sound record concerning harmful interference mitigation before approving unlicensed use of the band 5925? Yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, you have been abundantly gracious, and to my colleagues, I express my thanks.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
can I state for the record that the reason why I did not object was Michigan's kindness in allowing the Huskers to score that last touchdown in the last 2 minutes for a victory?
You know, the gentleman from Nebraska, I was hoping to go the entire hearing without discussing football. We didn't do so well as Ducks on Thursday night, so we'll have that discussion later. Now we'll turn to the gentleman from Ohio, I think, is up next, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and again, thanks to our panel. One of the things we've talked about in this committee, the subcommittee, is that industry usually is much farther ahead than Congress or the regulators would be. We're always might be 2, 3, 4 steps behind, and that's why it's so important to have you before us today to hear your testimony. And if I could just go down the line, we've been having questions as to where we're looking at today, but I'd really like to ask everyone, and also from the Mr. Knapp with the commission, as to where do we're talking about where we are today, but where we're going to be in 5 years or 10 years. Just if you could look in that crystal ball and just briefly just tell me where you think, because I know that Mr. Friday, in your testimony, you've stated that we've seen the Wi-Fi side over the last decade generate about $37 billion. But where are we going to be in the next 5 years? Because this is changing so quickly. Where do you think we're going to be?
So, I think if we look what's happening right now, as I mentioned, we're kind of moving from what I call a mobile voice paradigm, right? We're moving from this paradigm to a very mobile video paradigm on this here. So 5 years from now, I suspect we're going to see many more sharing technologies. When you look at the problem of this and this requires 100 times more capacity, which is going to require 100 times more from the fixed resource we have. So I think we're going to have to see more licensed spectrum policy, and I think we're going to have to really leverage the sharing spectrum policy going forward.
Mr. Nagel?
Well, I think that's right. I think there are other things we'll find as well, and that is that it's not just individual devices that we're going to want to have more capacity for because they require it. It's going to be that all of us have lots of devices as well, and this will occur both inside the home with the Internet of Things as we have almost everything in our home begin to connect and we're controlling our house. And it's one of the reasons why as we look to the future, we're sitting here today, right? I mean, we look at as we see the growth, I mean, just looking at our network and the network that we build in Wi-Fi, we have triple-digit growth in sessions and users and tonnage literally every year. And it's not abating, it's accelerating. And without some of the things we're talking about here today, I think it really becomes critical. And I think it really requires both sort of true deep consideration, both in the UNE-1 band, which we've been talking about, but also in the UNE-4 band. And I think one of the struggles that we have is when we look at sort of what's been going on in the ITS is that this is something that was thought of 15 years ago, and the world has changed so radically. You're asking what is going to happen in the next 5 years. If we look 15 years ago, what's happened, that having 75 megahertz sort of dedicated to something that was really developed, thought of and conceptualized 15 years ago, if we don't sort of fix this today and really work through how Wi-Fi is going to be a part of that band, it's only going to get more expensive down the road because there's not a lot of other spectrum to do gigabit Wi-Fi in.
Thank you, Mr. Kenny. We were talking about what could be going on with cars talking back and forth to each other, but when's it going to be that we're going to just have that car drive us home or drive us to work?
Well, we hope to all live to experience that, don't we? That would be great. I think in 5 or 10 years we're going to see a very different driving experience than we have today. And with respect to this period of time we've been doing research on DSRC, we're now on the threshold of being able to cash in on that research. And I think in 5 and 10 years, our drivers are going to be able to experience the benefits of having a car that can intelligently help them avoid the most dangerous driving situations. So I think that the connected car is going to be a very exciting place to be in 5 and 10 years.
And Mr. Knapp, hearing all that, and with the FCC, how do you work at the FCC to make sure all these things can happen? That we don't, we work with the industry out here to make sure that the regulations that are promulgated make these things come to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I knew what was going to happen in 5 years. What I can tell you is this: we try to ensure that the opportunities are there with as least regulation as absolutely needed, so that the innovators can flourish. Personally, I think the sky is the limit, and there are things that have happened already that nobody would have predicted. There's synergy between licensed and unlicensed in ways that where 5 or 6 years ago we were arguing about which is better, when in fact the two of them complement each other. From the standpoint of the things we're discussing today, we're going to have to continue to drive spectrum efficiency and these kinds of advanced sharing techniques that we're working on. They're hard. They take a lot of thought and a lot of work and testing to make happen, and we're going to have to keep driving down that path. Sharing isn't the only solution. I think we'll still be looking at bands where reallocation makes sense, but these are going to be tough issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We now turn to Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, to the ranking member for convening this very important hearing today. As most of you certainly know, I served on this committee, subcommittee some years ago, and went off the committee to be the ranking on another committee. And with the election of Senator Markey now, I find myself back on this committee and glad that I'm here. There's been so much, there might be a round of applause, not for me, but for Mr. Markey, I suppose. But just listening to the testimony and just reviewing the material for today, we've made great advances over the last 4 or 5 years that no one could even imagine. And Mr. Knapp, I think you just hit the nail right on the head a few minutes ago. It's just limitless of what innovation can mean. Not only for the bottom line of your companies, but for the prosperity of our country. And so I want to thank you for all that you do, and thank you for your investment in the future. I'm going to start with Mr. Nagel. Mr. Nagel, I heard Mr. Friday a moment ago say that devices that support gigabyte Wi-Fi already exist. I'm not sure I fully understand and appreciate that. Is that correct?
Well, it is correct in the sense that devices have within them the brains and the antennas and all that to make gigabit Wi-Fi work. What it doesn't have is access to the spectrum. So you can build the electronics to make it work and be future-proof, which is what they've begun to do. And a lot of the equipment we're deploying is also capable of doing similar types of things. What's necessary, though, is for us to make and move forward on some of the 5 gigahertz decisions that are in front of us today. So the first would be UNE-1. We've already mentioned that all the information is in on the record, and the FCC is in the process of making some of those decisions. Our view is that we can do a lot within UNE-1 and begin to bring big channels, which is really what you need. So most devices today in Wi-Fi use 20 megahertz channels. When you get to enough, you'll put 160 megahertz together, and it's that concatenated spectrum band that allows you to do that amount of speed at one time. But it requires that spectrum and the unlicensed spectrum. And so that's where the 5 gigahertz becomes very, very important, not just in UNE-1, which is by far the easiest decision to make, we think, but also in UNE-4. And it does require harder decisions, but ones that we ought to make now before we get too far down the road.
But typically, certification and approval usually take a long time after spectrum. Would that be correct? After the spectrum is made available, typically it takes a while to get it perfected?
You know, it's an area, honestly, it's an area that I'm not familiar with. I think generally that it gets past, actually, I'm not sure how to answer that, to be honest with you. I think that as devices get built, as long as it's within the Wi-Fi standard, I think it can work within that band. Generally, when you get new bands is when you have to go through another approval, but it's not my area of expertise.
All right. In your testimony, you describe, Mr. Nagel, the growing importance of Wi-Fi in times of crisis. Can you elaborate on some of the examples of when this technology has proven valuable in times of crisis and explain the role that Wi-Fi can play in going forward in emergencies?
Sure, I'd love to. I mean, we have some examples that Comcast has been involved with. The first is Hurricane Sandy. We experienced it up in the Northeast, and you know, when the hurricane came through, a lot of the licensed cellular networks were down. So what would end up happening is that we had some of our Wi-Fi access points that were up and running, and people would actually go to those access points. They would connect with any of their devices. It didn't have to be cellular specific, and they could actually reach the internet. They might have to walk a few hundred yards because that's the closest one that they had, or maybe even further. But just having that connectivity was essential to those people who were essentially without knowledge of what was going on and when people were coming to help them.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, since I don't have 50 years on this committee, I won't ask unanimous consent to extend my time, and so this will be my last question. Mr. Kinney, what is your response? But I want you to promise me that when I do get 50 years on this subcommittee,
let me suggest, Mr.
I will have that difference.
Yes. I won't be here. Unless there's incredible medical advances.
I'm going to leave a note in the drawer.
Yeah.
Like that.
And you could go ahead and ask today, but probably wouldn't get it.
Thank you. Very quickly, Mr. Kinney, what is your response to the proposal by Cisco that would require Wi-Fi devices to detect and avoid the presence of DSRC systems on the channels that they wish to use?
We think that the Cisco detection proposal is a sound foundation to build on. We think there are a lot of unanswered questions about some of the technical details, but we look forward to exploring that as part of our outreach with the Wi-Fi community.
With the note in the drawer, I'll yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. We welcome you to the committee. We'll turn now to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a good hearing. I'm really kind of learning a lot. It's a great committee. It's just highly technologically focused for a lot of us. So this is what I'm getting out of the hearing so far. The gigabit Wi-Fi is the best, right? That the 5 gigahertz is the best band for unlicensed use of Wi-Fi. Is that? Mr. Kenny and Mr. Friday, you seem to think that the sharing aspect might work. And Mr. Friday thinks it's almost too late to propose movement for this 10-year use of the automobile industry on this ITS system at the upper band. You have the impression that it's probably too late to go down that route. Am I correct?
I would say I don't know. I would say that the ITS has been working on it for a long time. But no, I don't know if it's too late or not. I just think it's been they've been down that path for quite a while.
And Mr. Kenny, I'm sure you agree that you like your spot and you want to keep it.
Yeah, that's right. We think that the allocation decisions that the FCC has made in the past make a lot of sense.
Mr. Nagel, you want to chime in on this? Because that seems what the debate is.
I do want to chime in on it. I think it's an important point. So, we all see what's happening in the broadband space is that we are struggling to keep up with the spectrum demands of just people connecting and the economic value and innovation that that's bringing to the country. That the spectrum allocation that's been made in the UNE4 band was made long before any of this rapid growth happened.
It was when it was determined kind of a junk space. It
was a junk space. No one
earlier.
Quite knew what to do with it. And so I think it's really important for us not to think about, is it too late, but what is the right thing for us to do for both aspects of the American economy. One is clearly we agree with the concept of vehicle-to-vehicle safety. I think we would never want to do anything that would harm that. We also know that the 75 megahertz is not going to be used wholly for vehicle-to-vehicle safety. There are components of it that are going to have other business aspects. The second thing we know through the recently released GAO report is that it's decades before the capability of vehicle-to-vehicle, sort of the full benefits, are going to be realized, primarily because the life of the fleet requires it to have this built in. You have to go through and have all the cars off the road. There'll be some benefits early on, but it'll be a while. The other thing the GAO report states is that there are significant components of this whole infrastructure that are they're sort of unknown. They're still in development. The back office component, all the pieces. So when I look at it, I see 75 megahertz of spectrum that we know Wi-Fi can share within. We would want to protect the vehicle-to-vehicle, but that the idea of having 75 sort of underutilized spectrum probably doesn't make great policy sense long-term. And that I think what we would like to see is not a decision about whether Cisco makes sense or not. That's one of the proposals. But there are at least two proposals, there may be more. But we'd like to see really rolling our sleeves up, engineer to engineer, with real compromise, trying to solve the problem of not how do I just protect all of the 75 megahertz of band, but how do I make Wi-Fi work within it and make it a viable business? And I think, but also protect the safety issue within the band.
And isn't in the, I'm visual too, so I've been watching this the whole time we've been having the hearing. So in the UNE4 and the upper area, if there was movement there, and they're not using all the 75, you do have a big band there for the applications, the Wi-Fi applications. But isn't there also a better debate where then you don't have the interference issue? Couldn't you engineer it so? I mean, we went through the light square debate.
Yeah, it's
unfortunately, I don't want to go through that again.
It's important to realize that what we're not saying, Wi-Fi is not intended to replace the incumbent. So the idea has never been within any of these bands to say that incumbent shouldn't use that space, let's move them. Wi-Fi by its nature is a sharing technology. It is meant to work within the context of the fact that you have incumbents, and its purpose is to not cause harmful interference. And where it does, we have to work through some of the technical details. It's the technical details that are required for us to sit down, both between the Wi-Fi and the ITS groups, and sit down and design what is the right thing from the beginning, from sitting here where we are, before it gets so far down the road that we have really underutilized spectrum, which probably doesn't make sense long term.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now turn to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate this. That's a very pretty chart. All the questions probably have already been asked, but not everyone has asked them, so I'm going to continue. But, Mr. Kenny, why don't we go through on it does seem that they're saying, Mr. Nagel, Mr. Friday, Knapp, that there is room for both. I think reading between the lines they didn't say, but maybe Mr. Nagel and Mr. Friday would say they'd love to have 100% of that band. But the reality is it has been set aside for the auto industry. I really like the idea of the vehicle-to-vehicle communications. I do think that's going to save lives. I like that we're getting into the 21st century in the automobile industry. That's exciting. So you have concerns that if it's shared and there's possibility of interference, that then creates safety issues. If your vehicle-to-vehicle is not communications is not reliable, then it could actually make it more dangerous on the road, not just safer. But if you're thinking it's going to communicate and tell you to stop and it's not communicating, you're more likely to get into a wreck then. So, from the automobile perspective, is there room to share? Is there danger posed in sharing?
Yes and yes. So with regard to is there room to share, I think the one way to think about that question is how would sharing work, and without being too technical, I'd like to suggest that it be on a spatial basis. And that means that in the roadways where the vehicles are, that's not where the Wi-Fi should be using 5.9 gigahertz. If there are places where Wi-Fi can use 5.9 gigahertz in a living room for entertainment purposes, or in a rural area where there aren't cars driving by, and we think that can probably be quite fine. But we don't want to have a mom driving a car down the road with kids in the back seat, and because she happens to be driving by a coffee shop that's using Wi-Fi, her collision avoidance system turns off, and she isn't able to avoid a collision that she otherwise could have. Or because her kids are playing some games in the back seat where their devices are talking to each other using Wi-Fi technology. That shouldn't be using 5.9 gigahertz Wi-Fi. That should use one of the other bands. So there's room to share more on a spatial basis. There are places where it can work. There are places where it shouldn't work.
Well, is there concerns, again, getting to what the chairman brought up at the beginning, if you're just using the top of the band and you're allowing the rest of the band barely below that, is there going to be concerns about interference?
Well, yeah, so let me state very clearly that we're not only going to be using the top of the band, and we're not only going to be using we're not only going to be able to put our safety critical communication in the top of the band. We have 75 megahertz, and we expect in deployment to be using all of it, and all of those channels will be carrying critical information. Not all the information will be critical, but all the channels will have critical information. So it's not possible to compress it into one or two channels.
Okay. Well, anybody, Mr. Nagel, Mr. Friday, would like to comment further? Or?
No, I mean, we've been working very closely with the ITS on the sharing. I mean, I think maybe Tom's point was if we had started from scratch, and we had built sharing into the original ITS design, would we have done something slightly different? And I think we're working with the ITS, though, they've been very cooperative on trying to find, given where we are, the right solution for sharing in the band.
Now, there was some comment, not here, but before the meeting, that it's taken 10 years to get here, and maybe the auto industry should have been built out by now. I guess the conclusion to that, if you take it, is therefore you should have to give it up. What do you think about that thought, Mr. Kinney?
Yeah, I think that that the automotive industry isn't consumer electronics, and when we're talking about safety of life, one thing I've found since I've been working for Toyota is that we take it very seriously, and we're very careful about deploying these technologies. So we now have the benefit of that period of time of intensive research. We've reached the threshold. We're ready to start deploying.
All right. Thank you. My time is up.
Gentleman's time's expired. We go now to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kinney, when you see these ads on TV with cars that they have you stop so you don't get into an accident, or maybe two cars ahead of you, it tells you about an accident up there. Now, that's not the 5 gigahertz, is it, that those rely on?
You're correct. Most of those types of technologies that you see advertised today are based on sensor systems that the car has. Maybe it's a radar or a camera system that can detect these dangerous situations.
So wouldn't that portend that you could share these or not need those?
Well, we think that those technologies are critical as well. We view the vehicle-to-vehicle communication as complementary to that. There are limitations of those sensor-based systems. The ranges are limited. Communication can go farther. If there's a vehicle in between you and the danger, the sensor may not be able to see it, whereas communication can let you know about it. If there's a vehicle
So it could be used in that instance on the
5
gigahertz could be used in that instance?
Yeah. So we
prevent
think
an
that the
accident?
5.9 gigahertz communication and the sensor-based systems on vehicles will work together to give us very safe driving.
But that's futuristic. That's not happening now. They're not using that now.
The communication part is not yet deployed, but that's coming very soon.
Okay. And Mr. Knapp, I've got a question regarding the dedicated short-range communications. My constituents' privacy is real important to them. So for people back in my district, do you think the FCC will propose protections of an individual's privacy so car companies won't be sending personalized advertisements to individuals based on where their car is located?
So the Commission has provided the spectrum. The standards are developed by the industry, including the privacy protections, and I think the GAO report had addressed the importance of the need for the standards to address those things. And I know that the industry has been taking those things into account. The FCC generally has not set standards specifically for that.
Well, it doesn't work unless they mandate that all cars have this. Is that correct? Or?
So the technology contemplates communication between vehicles. And so some have speculated that a percentage of the vehicles would provide an added benefit, but the idea is that eventually all of the vehicles would have this technology as compared to what we just heard described. The radars that are built in the car basically works autonomously. I don't need to communicate or worry about whether something is installed in somebody else's car.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and I think that takes care of all our members and their questions. I do have a unanimous consent request, a letter and report from SES and Intelsat detailing interference concerns of satellite providers in the 5.9 gigahertz band, and a GAO report by Mr. Nagel that he referenced, referenced on the benefits and challenges of ITS. So we'd like to put in the record without objection. So ordered.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from California.
Close out the hearing today by saying thank you to Roger Sherman for his superb service here. I really don't know what we're going to do without Roger. That's how fabulous he really is. He is, I think, in many ways in a class by himself, and I think that it is an eloquent statement about him that the new chairman of the Federal Communications Commission has chosen him, named him as the acting chief of the FCC's Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. I don't know how many members know his background. In the 111th Congress, Roger, he began here, and he has really been the backbone of this subcommittee, and he's led the staff in a way that really brought out the best leadership qualities of everyone that was part of the team. And I think that that's the mark of a leader and a confident leader. He has supported members and staff on every issue we've tackled. He really has been the indispensable a person here. His strategic guidance, his expertise, his professionalism are all going to be missed, I think, by every member of the committee. And to our colleagues on here on the subcommittee on the other side of the aisle, I think when we go to negotiate, you're going to miss Roger as well.
No.
You may even be relieved
Nope.
that he's not there, but he's not going to be far away.
That's right. We're
He's
going to
not gonna
subpoena
be
him
far
and have him
away.
under
Yeah.
oath now, and I've got several questions.
Yeah. So I have no doubt that Roger Sherman is going to make extraordinary contributions at the FCC. We all look forward to working with you in the new role, Roger. And, you know, from a very deep, respectful place, we salute you. You have devoted yourself. You could make so much money outside of this institution, but he remains with it because he has such a great commitment to it. And I think that that's a very important story for the American people because he's here to help to create wins for our country. And I don't think there could be any more beautiful commitment. And we need people like you to continue on in public service. You've certainly enhanced mine and all of ours here. So we're going to miss you. We thank you enormously. We thank you enormously for everything that you've done. And I will never, ever forget it. I'm a better legislator because of you, but more importantly, you have made great contributions to the entire subcommittee and the full committee. So God bless you. Go forward and do great things at the FCC. And when things aren't working out, you're going to be our point man. we're not letting you go. So, Mr. Chairman,
and remember that the FCC is an offshoot of the Congress, and so never forget that either.
That's right,
as you go downtown.
Yeah.
How about a round of applause for
Thank
Roger
you, Mr.
Sherman?
Chairman. Bravo.
And on that happy and appropriate note, that concludes our hearing. We thank our witnesses again for sharing your comments with us, your testimony, your counsel and guidance, and we stand adjourned.